Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, lawmakers in the UK Parliament have declared an environment and climate emergency, making it the first country in the world to do so. The motion was called by Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. The move comes a week after 16-year-old Swedish student Greta Thunberg addressed UK lawmakers to demand more climate action, and in the wake of protests by climate action group Extinction Rebellion, who blocked major landmarks in London. Earlier this week, the Welsh and Scottish governments had both declared a climate emergency. There's no clear definition of what declaring a climate emergency means, but several cities, including Bristol and London, have already declared their own. This week's Labour motion also called on the government to set a target of reaching zero emissions before 2050. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take a closer look at climate change and how serious the world is about tackling it. Joining me on the program today are Nitin Desai, Chairman, the Energy and Resources Institute, Professor C.K. Varshney, Environment Sciences, JNU, and Dilip Sinha, former Special Secretary, International Organizations and Environmental Diplomacy, Government of India, and former ambassador as well. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin the program with you. Declaring a climate emergency, the UK Parliament has done that. It's not binding on the government, of course. So what does it really mean?
I would say that what I see happening there with this young students' revolt and on climate issues and so on is basically a reaction to the sense that governments are not acting sufficiently rapidly. There is a sense that the commitment on environmental action, particularly even on climate, in Europe particularly, has come down quite substantially. I frankly wouldn't say that for the other parts of the world, certainly not for India and China, where you have certainly seen active action on these issues. So my sense is that what you're seeing in these demands are really a reaction to the perceived absence of action by governments. Is it justified? Can we say, yes, there is a climate emergency and that we ought to be doing something absolutely exceptional, even at the cost of short-term growth, etc., to address it? I would say that the fact is that every single assessment of climate change that we have received has been more alarming than the previous one. If I take the fifth assessment, since then what we have heard about Arctic ice, about sea level temperatures, etc., has been significantly worse than what the fifth assessment had said. So my feeling is that we are in a situation where I wouldn't necessarily use the word emergency, but certainly that the evidence is that we are fast running out of time.
Okay.
And for that reason, I would argue that this is really a response to the lack of action, particularly by the governments in the West and more particularly in Europe. And the United States is a case by itself because there is one government there which doesn't do much in Washington, but there are more than half the states have governments which are doing far more than what Washington would like them to. So leave that to one side. I would say this is probably my reading of this. It's more a political thing rather than just a drive to how should we react? We'll come to that.
Yeah, we'll come to that. We'll come to how India should react and what steps we should really take and how the world is and what exactly the world is doing and must do. But before that, Professor, let's try and understand how grave the situation is. Mr. Desai very rightly pointed out that every report is worse than the previous one. So how bad is the situation?
I think the situation is very deplorable. In fact, climate change is unstoppable and it is catastrophic. And as it is moving forward and unfolding, we are realizing that the implications and the damages and the kind of irreversible changes are very serious. In fact, from the purely economic point of view, it is going to cost us very dearly. For example, just to give you a few ideas, that in the last 4 years, 2018 has been one of the warmest years. And one of the worst calamities we have seen in 2018, wildfires, cyclones, and all kinds of other calamities which have come, droughts, as well as the hot wind and so on. So the question is that these hot spots and the kind of heat and the drought that is happening place, agriculture failure, and all these things are happening, and they are having a serious toll on global biodiversity, for which currently there is a meeting going on in Paris, and which is showing alarming consequences of the global warming across all kinds of organisms, vertebrate, invertebrate, and including microorganisms. So the question is the very basis of survival and humanity and the civilization and, so to say, industrialization at stake. And this needs to be appreciated. And there is no prescription that is available. The question is that we have to act, and there is a closing window of time before us, and the time is very limited, and this must be addressed. And I must say that this young girl, which is 16-year-old, has very mature thinking, and she started really working on this. Every Friday she was before the Parliament of Switzerland and Parliament of Sweden, and where she was really doing this kind of a hartal or whatever you may call it. And then this continued, and on 15th of March there was large number of schools across the world which really joined her call of really making their governments and their political masters aware of the seriousness of the situation.
Right.
Because it is the young generation which is going to face the music in a worst way. It has got some tremendous health implications, and it is going to create a downward spiral in terms of economic growth and economic prosperity. So I think these are very serious issues, and they are time consuming, and it requires thinking, it requires innovative action, and which is completely lacking except talks. I must tell you that after 2015, when we have this Paris Agreement, we have really slided down on many parameters across the world. First of all, politically as well as geographically and natural calamities. For example, Trump was the United States, which is supposed to be giving a leading example to the world, slipped out of this and said very, I should say, unintelligently that they are going to withdraw. And for that, there are a large number of allies which are following them, such as Poland, such
Right.
as Australia. They are also really wriggling out, and their actions, one can see that there is a coal which is becoming a king again. For example, the new mines and the kind of coal policy that the Australia has, the policies that the Poland has, I think it's going to be very, very serious.
Right. Okay, we'll talk about whether irreparable damage has been done and how do we really reverse what has happened over the last few decades. But before that, is there a change in attitude, Ambassador? I asked this question because, several cities in Europe have declared climate emergencies. The US House of Representatives has passed a bill on Thursday, the first bill on climate change in a span of 1 decade. So is the attitude changing?
Well, it's kind of coming back, I would say. If you go back to the late 1980s, when climate awareness first started and the first steps were being taken, between 1988 and 1992, when the Earth Summit took place, the movement was extremely rapid. And that was because the governments responded very positively to the pressures that were built by the non-government organizations, especially in Europe. Because the pressure for climate change negotiations and climate change action actually came from NGOs in Europe and public opinion in Europe. And that is how the world moved towards the Rio Summit and then came up with these agreements. The UNFCCC was set up, and then the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in the teeth of opposition from the US. The US Congress at that time was opposed to the Kyoto Protocol. The US signed the Kyoto Protocol way back in 1997, and then the government of President Clinton got scared of putting it to Congress for approval. Now, then the pressure from European public opinion NGOs continued, but by 2008, when the economic crisis took place, then this problem of immigration came into Europe, and a whole lot of other problems came in, and governments lost the enthusiasm, and public opinion also became a little lax. The result was that then China and the US got together, and they came up with their own agreement in 2014, which effectively gave the death knell to the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was abandoned, and in 2 years later, essentially based upon what China and the US had agreed upon, the world came up with this Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is a very weak agreement, but it was the best that could be agreed upon. And again, as I said, the Paris Agreement was agreed upon because the US did not want an agreement which would require the administration to go to Congress for approval, because they felt that any agreement of an externally imposed emission cut would be dead on arrival at the US Congress. So it is again a reversal of situation that today the US Congress is asking the administration, because the administration has gone into the hands of President Trump, who is a climate skeptic. So it's a good thing that in the US Congress is now putting pressure upon the government to take action. And in Europe, the public opinion is coming back and is rebuilding pressure upon governments to take action. And this particular British resolution is an example of it. This young Swedish girl is another example of it. And I think this partly because the fact that in Europe, people can see, not only Europe, all over the world, people can now see the impact of climate change. So the dire predictions that were being made by the IPCC and all other international experts on climate change are slowly coming true. Last October, there was that report, a special report prepared by the IPCC, which said that it's still possible to take some action and control the situation, not control, at least mitigate the damage that is likely to come from climate change if we take action now. So that, I think, was a wake-up call, and it's good that people, especially in governments also, are now waking up to the fact that this is a serious situation and action needs to be taken. But it's extremely interesting that even while the House of Commons adopted the resolution and used the term emergency, the UK Environment Secretary, Michael Hove, he did not use the word emergency, he used the word grave for the situation.
Right.
So there is still that skepticism that perhaps if you use extreme terms, then governments will come under pressure to take action which will damage their economic policies.
Certainly. All right.
I tell you that why government should not be come under pressure to take action. Because even if you start taking action now, it is going to be a while before actually results will come. And there is a tide of people, young people. In Australia, there has been a large number of councils which have really said that there is a climate emergency. In fact, we have been dragging our feet for the last 2 decades by not really saying that this is a very, very important, unprecedented problem that the civilized world or the industrialized world or the contemporary world is facing, for which they have no solution. Let alone solution, they have not even understood the problem in all its dimensions, vertically and horizontally. And I think situation not only grave, is very serious. If you start working now, it will take time for some results to come. In fact, for adaptation, we have to really work, and there is hardly any thinking around the world where seriously the questions of adaptation is being talked about. So we have to adopt, because it is, you just cannot wish away climate change by just saying. The governments may go slowly, doesn't matter, but the climate change is moving much faster. So the distance between the action that we are taking and the kind of action that is required, the gulf is increasing. We may say that we have taken some action, but that is no respite. In fact, our action is too short to really attend to the kind of problems that we are facing, and which are very right that the youngsters are taking these in hands. In fact, in Delhi itself, the college students have really demonstrated that we need climate change. And this tide is going to become a tsunami very soon, because people are affecting, their livelihood is affecting, and their jobs are affecting, their health is getting affected. So the question is that why delay? And delay for whom? Because people don't understand those who are really. So I think this is a very serious issue.
I think, let me say that about what Professor Varshney is reflecting is something which has had an impact. The impact that has come is today there's a much more widespread recognition of the realities of what is likely ahead of us. And that has made the one big change that I see compared to the past. I see a change in the market system. It's not that easy to raise money for a coal-based power plant now. You try and raise the money for a coal-based power plant in London or New York, you will not succeed. Look at the fact that the investments in renewable energy now exceed investments in fossil fuels. Look at the fact that increasingly the space that is being seen as an area of competition for technological leadership is increasingly things like electric vehicles, energy efficiency, etc., etc. Why are people so worried about China's program? Because China is stealing a march in many of these areas. Now, this is a very positive thing, that in a sense, the market and corporations and consumers are moving faster than governments in many areas. So I would say that part of the reason that we are seeing some of this is basically a reflection of the changing sentiments, not just amongst environmental activists, but amongst very ordinary people, amongst commercial people, amongst market practitioners. Why are we getting so many companies who are signing up on the zero emission thing? Why, on the scientific emission group as it's called? Many companies are now signing up. Why? Why are they doing it? Because they see this as increasingly inevitable. So why not steal a march on the others? The other thing that I think is very crucial and important, which we need to recognize, is the adaptation dimension which was mentioned. There will be some climate change which is going to come regardless. You are going to see places in this country which will have 50-degree temperatures not for a few days, but maybe for a few weeks. We will have to learn how to cope with that in terms of the way we design our cities, the way we design our buildings, the way we design our energy system, and so on. There are many changes which we will have to make in our energy system. Our energy system of 2050 will be essentially built around electricity. Not around, it will be the most important source of energy for everybody, for everything. Most things will be through electricity. Are we designed for that? Are we designed for all of these things? So there's a huge amount of thinking which needs to go into how we need to change our systems to cope with the reality of climate change, energy in other areas, and so on. But I personally am a little more optimistic because I think the market system is moving faster than governments are.
Right. I'll just come to you, Professor, but before that, Ambassador, so has irreparable damage been done, and are we ready really for what Mr. Desai is talking about, weeks of 50 degrees of temperature, very cold winters, abnormal weather patterns?
Well, the reports from the experts indicate that, yes, we are moving towards a very difficult situation. We have already reached the temperature increase has already been about 0.85 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial levels. And it is estimated that it will cross 1% soon. And by I think it was the last report that came out, said that it would reach 1.5 degrees anytime in the middle of this century, perhaps a little later, but nobody knows for sure. But the good thing is that the report of the IPCC, that special report, also said that if we start taking action now, then we will be able to mitigate some of the consequences, which appear inevitable now. But it is still not too late. And whether it is for the tropical or subtropical areas or temperate areas, everywhere it will be possible. The sea level rise can be controlled. It will be, in any case, they said that 0.26 to 0.77 meters by 2100. But they said that if we are able to take action now, then we can keep it down by about 10 centimeters.
Right. Okay. Now solutions, Professor. What are the solutions? What can we do in the immediate near future?
I would like to really score 2 points. Number one, it is not only the power sector or energy sector which is responsible. It is only part of the story. The real story is land use changes, which are far more serious and perhaps contribute equally. And also the question of agriculture, which accounts for 24% of the climate change emission or the carbon dioxide emission. So I think it is a wholesale activity that we have really so far designed need to be scrutinized and has to be changed, and it's a massive task. It cannot happen overnight. For that, the thinking and the action must start. In fact, it is already late, I must say, because the consequences are such that when the coastal cities are going to really get flooded, I will give you just one example. We have got large number of dams around the world. Lot of capital investment has gone, and lot of power is generated, which is really taking care of our present day society. None of these power plants and the dams were constructed keeping in mind the climate change. And as a result, the whole catchment area has been totally degraded. Huge amount of silt is coming, and in fact their foundations are getting eroded and overloaded. So the question is, even the existing structures are at a tremendous amount of threat, and under these circumstances I can say that the consequences, the ramifications of climate change are far greater and far more. In fact, every sector of the economy has to work out in detail as to how they are going to address. In fact, I will say every institution, not only corporation alone, has to really come out that from now on this is what we are going to do, and in a time bound manner they must really show and scrutinize their own activity, that every year we are really making a progress in order to really cut down those activities which adversely affect the climate, ultimately the future of mankind and our own well-being.
Certainly. All right. That having been said, Mr. Desai, the other side of the problem is, of course, water scarcity. There are several reports that suggest that we probably won't have potable drinking water come 2050 or 60.
The impact on perhaps the one area for us which is more serious is the whole area of adaptation which is required in the land and water side, particularly on water, because what you're going to see is a much greater level of disruption, more rain on fewer days. We're talking of the cyclone in Orissa. Now, I would not wish to attribute that to any climate change or anything, but things like that may become more frequent than they have been in the past. The simple way of putting it is more rain on fewer days. You may get long areas where the river is without water, and then the river will get vast amounts of water because the snow melt is faster in the Himalayas because of rising temperatures up there. So I would say that
North India at least has the luxury of the Himalayas, but you go down south, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and all these other states. There are several reports that are coming this week.
There are complicated impacts on rainfall and so on. But the reality is that you will see a water regime which is more disruptive. I'll give you a very interesting story. We were doing a study once in Uttarakhand, and the farmers didn't understand the word climate change. The official Hindi translation is Jalvayu Parivartan.
Yes.
It's official, nobody understands. But the one term they understood was climate instability, Ritu Asantulan. Now, and one of the farmers put it so beautifully. He says, "Main abhi mausam pad nahi sakta hu." That is, they have traditional ways of looking at the sky is red there, this will happen. And they say, "Main abhi mausam pad nahi sakta hu." वो जो पंछी अभी इस महीने में आता है, अभी अब आने लगा है, वो झरना यहाँ तक जून तक चलता था, अभी अप्रैल में सूख रहा है. So their whole assessment I've noticed, is increasingly in terms of the impact of climate on things like water, on things like the biotic systems and so on. And I think that ground level perception of very simple, ordinary farmers tells us much more than a lot of the very fancy talk that we may get in at seminars and books and things of this sort. So I think we should start understanding this better, getting together, and as I would completely agree with Mr. Vaishnavi, it's not just energy and climate. Almost every area that we are working in will need to rethink.
Right.
I would like to see in this country somebody doing a study. What will my energy system, what will be my agricultural system, what will my water system, my urban management system, what will it look like in 2050 if we are going to be able to cope with climate change? But that, I think, is something that I hope will happen. And one of the things I personally am very reasonably positive about is the fact that countries like India and China have responded.
Right.
Not just at a governmental level, but also at the level of companies, at the level of people, at the level of awareness, at the level of understanding. You're doing this program now. I'm not sure you would have done this program 10 years ago or 20 years ago. That's the difference.
All right. So what's the best way forward then, Ambassador? What is it that we need to do?
In India, we have a double whammy. The double whammy comes from the fact that on the one side, we have the global climate change taking place, for which we are not a major contributor. We are a big contributor today. But as far as historical emissions are concerned, our contribution is negligible. But nevertheless, we'll face the consequences of climate change. So we have that on which we can only contribute to a little bit extent, to a slight extent, because no matter what we do, if the larger emissions keep continuing, then climate change will take place regardless of what we do. But on the other hand, we have the problem of waste management. because of which we are destroying our water resources, and the waste that goes into the plastics that we consume, that goes into the rivers, into the oceans, that is going to impact our immediate agriculture, water availability. So we will face these dual problem. And you mentioned about the Himalayas. The fact is that if the glaciers, as they already have started melting, if they melt further, then the entire buffer that we have been used to over millennia will vanish. And I don't know how much effort we are making today, but the fact is that because of various reasons, there's a lot of human activity taking place in the Himalayas, apart from the global impact of climate change, as a result of which we, as I said, have this huge problem that we have our own water resources are getting contaminated, water tables are falling, the glaciers are melting, and on top of that, we have the problem of pollution of the air and the water. So we have to take action regardless of what our international commitments are.
Right.
Whether the Paris Agreement asks for something or doesn't ask for something, we have to take immediate action because the environment in the cities is extremely bad. So quite apart from the temperature, you have to worry about the pollution levels in our cities and also the pollution of our water.
Right.
So we have to take action on all these steps, in all these areas for our immediate benefit.
Certainly, certainly. All right. The situation is dire, really. The time to act is already gone. There's something that needs to be done immediately, and there is indeed a climate emergency, is what the panelists are suggesting. The silver lining is that governments around the world and people too have woken up to this problem, and there is a change really, and we could probably see something happening in the near future. With that, I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.